in welcoming all of you to this meeting. I'm not sure if it will be relevant for us to do an introduction of those in the meeting because we're really running against time. So I'm guessing if people are going to make contributions, they can introduce themselves before they make their contributions. I will, however, introduce at some point the panelists for this conversation as we proceed. Matthias was supposed to join us, but unfortunately he's not able to. So I'm filling in his role, to just say welcome and to thank Waxy for agreeing to partner with us to host this meeting. And the team that worked on this, both from our side and from the Waxy side, we're really very grateful for putting together what is shaping up to be an excellent and exciting conversation today. The question is, why do we think this conversation is important? Why are we having this conversation at this time? Reality is that every African, every West African, and anybody who loves democracy is worried. Worried because of what is obviously becoming a relapse, if I may use that word, of democracy across the globe. And given where we are coming from, all the excitement of the 90s when West Africa started, with speed to take away the clothes of the military dictators and usher in a period of democratic governance. That excitement is going off in a way that is scary for each and every one of us. For us at OSIWA, the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, by the way, that's where I work. I work out of the Abuja office. For us at OSIWA, looking at this trend reminds us that the stability or consolidation of democracy can never be something that happens on autopilot. A lot of work has to go into it for it to happen. We are now looking at what is going on in Guinea, where the president is going for a third term, where the constitution has been amended in a way and manner that is making everybody uncomfortable. We're looking at Mali, where the military actually took over power. We are looking at Côte d'Ivoire with all the trappings of crisis and the fact that the president again is going for a third term. Across the region, our democracy is on a very shaky ground. And even in the places where we have election, we're increasingly seeing a democracy that has been captured, where the outcome of elections in most of our countries are more or less taken for granted because all the instrumentality and the structures of democracy are already taken over by incumbents and are then manipulated for them to deliver a desired or predetermined outcome. We're also seeing a democracy that is increasingly not listening to the people, where the people are oftentimes just used as a validation tool, to get the procedural validity of a democracy, even though in practice that's not the case. And so we remember our people in places like Nigeria only when the elections come. And we introduce policies, find ways of giving them money and getting them to support us. And then life continues. We are also worried about the inefficiency of our of our regional framework to confront some of these anomalies. So we're seeing an increased endangerment of democracy. And sadly, why this is happening in our continent, the trends of democracy outside of our continent, the historical support system and support groups that help us to, in times of emergency, to strengthen our own systems or to hold people accountable, are also faltering. The United States is in dire crisis, almost imploding right in front of our eyes. The guardrails of their democracy weakened in an unprecedented manner. And so they're looking inwards and nobody's looking outward anymore. You look at the United Kingdom, caught up in the throes of a rather fractious Brexit, making it difficult for them to play that role they used to play in our continent. Same for France. COVID has also undermined the capacity and the capability of the European Union, meaning therefore that the solutions to our problems will have to come from us. And it's on the basis of that that we are posing the question today. What role can civil society groups do to address the current challenges and realities of our democracy? How can we do it? Where are we coming from? What needs to be done for us to make a change in the way our democracy works? I would close these introductory remarks by saying that if nothing happens, if we continue to engage government, democracy the way we are doing right now, there's every chance that more and more countries in the region will be destabilized. There's every chance that citizens will begin to lose faith in democracy. There's every chance that the excitement of the 90s may turn into agonies of the 20s. And that will be a reality that is really, really frightening for any one of us to face, because we know that in spite of its imperfections, democracy remains the most agreeable form of government, even with its imperfections. It might not be perfect, but that's the best we see right now. And that's the best we can give our people. But we cannot continue to engage this decline the way we're doing. So we're hoping that this conversation will, one, help us understand better what has gone wrong, what is happening to our democracy. But most importantly, we're looking at creative ways, suggestions, ideas on how we as the third sector institution can begin to confront this reality and help our people to get back to the path of democratic consolidation, to have a democracy that not only delivers on elections, but also delivers on governance. So that's why we've invited all of you today for this conversation. And excitingly, we are happy to have, a very powerful set of individuals who are going to be speaking with us today, providing insights on the conversation we are going to have. So I will, in a short while, introduce the panel, but the format of the conversation is going to be in a structure where all the panelists will answer, one or two questions from the moderator, and then we go to the other participants to provide ideas, questions, as the case may be. The first set of questions, the panelists will spend about 10 minutes. You don't have to use all the 10 minutes to answer the question, and then probably have some follow-up questions, go around with the panelists, and then we'll move to the other expert participants in the conversation. And so the first panelist on my list is my sister, Nana Afazinu, who is the executive director of WAXI. Nana has been in this fight for a better and credible democratic society in the region for almost 19 years or more. She's a lawyer, a human rights activist, an expert in every sense of the word, actually. Once she was a visiting scholar at Columbia University Human Rights Advocate Training Program. Nana has been here. She's worked with OSIWA. She's worked with a number of other regional organizations. One of his roles was the regional policy advisor for IBIS West Africa before she joined WAXI. And Nana brings conversation, immense knowledge of the region, critical understanding of democracy. and what it takes to build a society that is premised on rule of law and a responsive democracy that answers to the people. So Nana, we thank you for making yourself available for this conversation. Next on the list is somebody. Next on the list is somebody we know very well. Prof needs no introduction, but I will try to summarize, just a little bit about about him. Of course, Prof is the co-founder of Afrobarometer. Professor Emmanuel Jima. Excuse me. Professor Boadi is the co-founder of Afrobarometer and served as its executive director from 2008 to 2019. It is important to make the point that Afrobarometer has become the place to go in everything related to trends and information about democracy in the continent. And Prof also worked with CDD Ghana, but I really think that the work Prof is doing with Afrobarometer has served to fill a major information and knowledge gap in the continent, and been able to provide for most of practitioners and everybody interested in democracy empirical information of trends, how people are thinking, what people are expecting with respect to democracy in this country. Before that, like I mentioned, of course, he is the amount of work in Ghana and across the globe, and we're really excited, Prof, that you made out time to be part of this conversation, and I thank you for being here. Third on the list is Miss Farida Naborema. Farida is a political activist. People in Togo get really very uncomfortable, including their president. Farida has been in the field, fearlessly advocating for democracy and human rights in Togo. And not just Togo, across the continent. Farida has also worked as a major movement builder for democracy around Africa. She founded at the age of 20 the Forum Must Go movement, about Farida's TED Talk on dictatorship and the story of her country has gathered over 1.5 million views to her knowledge, in-depth knowledge, and what it means to mobilize people in the community to address instances of dictatorial tendencies in what otherwise would have been a democratic government. So we welcome you, Farida. And lastly, but not the least, is Miss Ajayaman. Please pardon me if I don't get the last names correctly. I apologize. She is a social change strategist, currently co-founder of Epic Africa. She's a seasoned professional in global philanthropy and a designer at the core with a strong passion for strengthening civil society to advance human rights, gender equity, well-being, and economic inclusion. She's been around, managed grants locally and internationally. She was a grant manager at Trust Africa in Dakar, Senegal, and also a senior program associate at Moria Fund in Washington, D.C. So welcome, and thanks again for making out time to be with us here today. So, I think we need to get into the meat of the conversation. Kick it off. I'll start off with you, Nana, just to ask that you share some perspective on what has been the contribution of civil society to democracy in the region, but essentially under the current reality of a declining democratic environment, what should we be doing in these uncertain times? You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Your microphone much. Yes, I just put it on. My apologies for that. Thank you very much, Udo, for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this. And really, it's a conversation that I think this is the time for us to have this conversation, and not just to talk about it, but actually do something about it. To talk about what civil society's role has been, I think that I want to go back just a little bit to talk about the history. And I think when I talk about civil society here, pre-independence, we did have civil society, and a strong civil society movement that actually fought and worked towards fighting for independence. For a number of countries in West Africa. So we had civil society then, after independence, and particularly going towards in the time when we had military dictatorship. We did have civil society, student movements, political movements, even some voluntary market women's associations, etc., working hard so that we could have the kind of democracy that we had. And post the Cold War, with the democratic wave beginning in Benin Republic and the movements that started there to kick out Kreku, we now got this new wave where we have civil society organizations, and that came up really to help build the democracy in West Africa. And as we went ahead, we have kind of also had some evolution with the Arab Spring, and some years ago, social movements coming up supported by technology. Occupy Nigeria, Occupy Ghana, Yenama in Senegal, Ballet Citoyen in Burkina Faso, Togo debut, which I'm sure my sister will talk about. Gambia has decided, the recent Mali social uprising. These are all things that there has been some kind of evolution when it comes to civil society. I think that we have had support. We've had international support. We've had regional support. Some of the systems that we've had that has supported this kind of movement and civil society building, and particularly the strength of NGOs. But this is changing. Geopolitically, we have less multilateralism, weaker international institutions because particularly of the US stance in many of the things. They have been leading on this, and they have a strong clout politically. And so backing human rights, backing social justice has supported the international structure to support this. This is much, much weaker now. There are more populist governments that are coming up, particularly in the West. And because of that kind of international pressure that we had when it came to authoritarianism or dictatorship has weakened, to prevent that from happening. There's less emphasis on human rights and social justice. There's more emphasis on security and trade. There's an increasing China dominance, and we all know that the Chinese do not particularly care for human rights or social justice. The rising inequality, shrinking civic space is all part of this. There is also a certain economic pressure that is coming to our governments through some of the work that is going on financial action task force regulations, looking at anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism. And in a way, that is also affecting us politically, because even though our governments are being pressed economically, some of them are using that to shrink the space that civil society could engage in politically. And of course, we have changing donor policies, because even as we have had support in the past, because of the kind of geopolitical support that we had for pushing democracy and building democracy. This, as it decreases in the donor countries, has also decreased and has changed some of the donor policies that we have. Internally, of course, we have fewer and fewer resources. I'm looking at our internal ecosystem as civil society now. More resources have gone to international organizations and sometimes even contractors. Less funding has gone to, or resources have gone to strengthen the resilience of global South civil society. There's threatened sustainability due to years of lack of investment in building strong institutions. And even though there's a localization agenda now, it is really less about strengthening local civil society and more to some extent, particularly if you look at what has happened in the past years, more about international NGOs changing their identity to becoming local NGOs. And that, again, brings pressure on resources locally and actually weakens local civil society further. There are leadership and governance challenges within civil society, which we sometimes do not want to face, but these are some of the challenges. Civil society is not practicing what we preach in some of the cases. And where we are talking about issues related to transparency and accountability, we are looking at fighting inequality and discrimination. We talk about, point our fingers to succession, leadership succession, and things like that when it comes to the political actors, particularly politicians. And sometimes we do not look at ourselves and our own systems. And because of the democratic trend that we've gone through, we've also had people within civil society that have moved into government. And yet when they moved into government, what they were fighting for when they were in civil society is not what they were fighting for when they were in government. In fact, sometimes they did things that went against the things they were fighting for when they were in civil society. So that has affected some of the trusts that we had in civil society. We have a weak solidarity, collaboration. Organizations are more interested in their egos, their logos, working in silos. Sometimes in some of our countries, NGOs have been politicized. So we do have a serious issue when it comes to trust deficits among citizens for NGOs and for INGOs. There's a weak connection with citizens and communities that we are supposed to be serving, partly due to our external accountability to donors rather than communities and citizens. And again, with the social movements that I've talked about, there's a question about really the NGOs of the past that were leading some of the social change. That is not the situation right now. NGOs are not necessarily leading the change. You have social movements, and yes, sometimes you have NGOs that are part of these social movements, but they are not necessarily the ones leading the change. And so when we look at our role, we need to look at ourselves and how we can then play a better role. I think that we have to introspect. We are doing that right now. This is one opportunity as civil society, but we really need to take a serious look about the civil society space, ourselves we can call ourselves a sector, but we need to look at recalibrating what we see as civil society. It is not only NGOs. And we need to look at how we can bring in other constituencies to create a broader ownership. We have to practice what we preach. When we are pointing fingers at people to be transparent and accountable, we have to be transparent and accountable. We have to make sure that we are doing the things that we are preaching against. We also need to look at our resourcing. I've just been talking about the external, the fact that our resources have dwindled, external donor funding has gone down, the geopolitics is affecting us seriously. Of course, COVID has also brought its own issues, but that is affecting, that is because of the dependency that we have on external philanthropy. So how do we build our own local philanthropic culture and infrastructure that supports social justice, social protection, and social accountability? We have to find alternative ways of mobilizing resources and changing that dependency mindset. We also have to look at building more of an interdependent international development structure. And so we have to, even as we look at ourselves within, we have to look internationally to say, we are looking at an international development structure and system that we are all a part of. Where are the power imbalances and how do we balance that power? How do we get into those spaces? So for me, there are a number of things. I mean, I believe that Prof will speak extensively to the trends when it comes to particularly the democratic space. But I think that as civil society, we have to engage differently. We have to look at who we are engaging with. We have been working with government, yes, but even within civil society, can we bring in, can we reach out, look at the private associations, I mean the professional associations, look at voluntary associations. If we are going to change the discussion on democracy in West Africa, the people, the citizens have to be involved. So where are those spaces where the citizens at the grassroots are very much a part of, and how do they become part of our conversation so that it's not just groups, you know, organizations, but we really are getting more people. Are we engaging traditional? Are we engaging the people on the ground a lot more than we have been doing? How are we connecting a lot more with them? I think that when it comes to democracy now, you can say that many of our citizens, there's apathy. You know, it's like it's just elections. Every 4 years, there's a flawed election process that is driven by money and lies, and people just go and they vote. You know, they just know that this is a 4-year routine that we are going to go through. And you've already talked about what is happening with third-term issues. You know, some of these leaders wanting to stay in power beyond their term and manipulating the constitution and related institutions to doing that. So we need our people to engage, and it has to go beyond the civil society that we have always known. You know, if we are looking at social movements, how are we building that, and who are we bringing into the fold, and how do we make sure that we sustain the work that we have been doing? Because if we are working with civil society,
Nana, can I come in now?
Yes. Yeah, I have, how many minutes? I haven't looked at the minutes, but I just have.
You've exhausted your time, but I have some follow-up questions. Yeah. But I want us to go around first, then I'll come back to you with those questions. That will give you some more time.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that emphasis on, you know, clean up our house if we want to clean up the system. Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you, Prof. You know, over the years, you've been involved with the Afrobarometer, you know, following trends across the region and the continent on how democracy is performing, citizens' perception, quality of democracy, quality of elections, and all of that. So could you just talk to us a bit from your own assessment? What are the trends? What are you seeing? And what red flags, if any, are you identifying in some of the engagements you've been involved in with citizens across the region, and then, of course, with particular interest to West Africa? Thank you.
Thank you, and greetings to all colleagues, familiar faces, and others I'm here to meet. But I think this is a vital discussion to have. As I had said in some of my correspondence to the organizers, I wish we had 2 separate days for each of the topics, both to look at the trends and then also to look at the challenges, because they are a little bit different, but that's what we have. I also wanted to step back a bit and and basically recall some of the great achievements in the region, the West African region, with respect to democracy and good governance. You know that until recently, West Africa was largely seen as a democratic governance trailblazer among African regional bodies. Our region was distinctive. This is the region where the idea and practice of the ballot box as the sole legitimate mechanism for choosing political leaders has taken firm roots. An idea and a practice that has been underscored by Ghana's record of generally peaceful elections, 7 of them so far, with broadly credible electoral outcomes, 3 of which produce electoral turnovers. And we have had similar developments in Benin, in Sierra Leone, and elsewhere, and Senegal. It's a region whose leaders banded together in the 2000s to bring an end to civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, resolve political conflict and restore democratic order in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and arguably in Cote d'Ivoire. It's also a region whose regional body, ECOWAS, has a distinguished record of adopting and enforcing protocols that formally proscribe military coups. And we saw this exemplified by the use of credible threat of military force to ensure that the verdict of the Gambian voters in the elections, in the presidential elections, was respected. And they even continued to push out long-serving autocrat Yahya Jammeh. This is a regional body that a few years ago came very close to making presidential term limits a regional norm, a norm which, or an initiative that was only blocked by the autocratic leaders of Gambia and Togo. You put all of this against the more recent developments, some of which the moderator enumerated, Mali and the coup of August 18 and the circumstances behind the coup and behind the uprising. You put this past of great democracy and governance achievements against President Ouattara of Cote d'Ivoire's recent decision to run for a 3rd term, something that has sparked political instability and something that threatens to undo the previous sterling achievements in political and economic renewal in that country. You talk of Guinea, where President Condé, who himself rode on a crest wave of opposition to perpetual incumbency, is himself now decided to manipulate the constitution and the political processes of his country to go for a 3rd term against the judgment and wishes of the majority, a vast majority of Guineans. And when we show Afrobarometer data on some of this, you will see how much of a negative action this represents for the people of Guinea. And of course, you have Togo with the dynastic rule of the Yadema family continuing with Yadema Jr. continuing to block and to resist popular pressure, continue to engage in election irregularities and refusing basically to address the issue of 2-term limits as well as lack of development. Now, sometimes, on the face of it, it looks like the current democracy and governance challenges in Africa, and the trend is mainly a Francophone West Africa problem, at least from the examples I've selected for you. But it's clear that this is not an exclusive Francophone West African problem, and that democracy and governance is suffering its own stagnation and slow burn decay in many Anglophone West African countries as well. So Gambia, which was recently celebrated for making a breakthrough with the ouster of Yahya Jammeh and installing a president that came out of the people's verdict and so on, is now going south, heading south in many ways. You talk of, and maybe just because Ghana is has been such a shining example of democracy and governance progress, maybe I will just talk about Ghana, where an essentially rubber stamp parliament has been approving executive branch and presidency initiated draft legislation and ratifying dubious international laws and agreements. One that I've just recently returned to Ghana to meet is called a Japan Mineral Royalties, something that even The Economist magazine has raised questions about. You're talking in Ghana about an Akufo-Addo government that has forced out and has forced an assertive Auditor General to take his accumulated leave and essentially immobilized him from scrutinizing suspicious government expenditures going forward. We have in Ghana a president with Akufo-Addo's background who has increasingly earned infamy for announcing the clearance and for announcing the exoneration of government and ruling party bigwigs accused of corruption and abuse of power, typically after an internal inquiry. And Ghana, where the Supreme Court is frankly looking increasingly packed. So if Ghana is this way, it should tell you what is going on in the region in general and why it's important to flag these issues, to monitor and keep flagging these issues so that those countries in West Africa that don't seem on the face of it to be experiencing a crisis with democracy and governance are not ignored to their own peril. And I will make a comment about the importance of constant monitoring and constant and proactivity shortly. Now, from my standpoint, as somebody involved with the Afrobarometer, we see and get a lot of these expressions and manifestations of democratic governance supply challenges in some of the statistics that we'll be showing you shortly. So let's go to the data showing broadly the supply, the perceived supply of democratic governance, which is generally judged to be low. So you look at the 8 countries for which the latest data we have for the 8 West African countries, COVID stopped us from, we stopped the surveys across Africa because of COVID. So by the time COVID ended, we had been able to capture up to do the surveys in only 8 West African countries. But fortunately, we are going back to do the surveys in the rest of the countries of West Africa where we operate. So what we will show you with these slides are mainly our 8 countries for which we have new data. So when you look at this, in terms of supply of democracy, we've been asking people about to rate their countries as a democracy, a full democracy, or democracy with minor problems versus not a democracy at all, or a democracy with major problems. Then we've also been asking them whether they are satisfied with the way democracy works in their country or not. And you find that on the average, only a small majority, 54%, say that they see their countries as broadly democratic. And it's only a minority that says they are satisfied with the level of democracy in their country generally. The next slide speaks to the responses to the question about whether, in the eyes of citizens, public officials who commit offenses, who engage in wrongdoing, are punished. That is a measure of official impunity. And you see that across the 8 countries, it's about 4 out of 10 citizens who believe that officials in their country who commit offenses are punished. So it's a picture of official impunity that is being conveyed. You look at the picture of our findings on trust in institutions and their leaders, and you find that, again, when it comes to popular trust in elected leaders and in public officials, the trust levels are very low, with the notable exception of the military, where in general, across West Africa, trust in the military is very high. Maybe it's only less so in comparison to to religious leaders. So you look at the rest of it, it's middling trust ratings or almost negative trust ratings. Similarly, when you ask the question, in your opinion, over the past year, has the level of corruption in this country increased or decreased? Again, you get a clear majority saying that this corruption has been increasing in their country. So this is basically conveying a picture of popular ratings of government and the performance of these countries on the democracy and good governance front, which is saying that we don't like what we see. Let's move on. By comparison, the findings with respect to evaluations with respect to how strongly and how firmly West African citizens desire democracy and accountable governance, you get a different picture. And the picture that you basically, the conclusion you come away with is that definitely the degree to which citizens say they desire democracy and accountable governance in West Africa is way below the degree to which their elites and political leaders are delivering on the same values to them. So we start with popular support for choosing our first popular support for democracy versus rejection of authoritarian alternatives of government. You find that whereas popular support for democracy stands at an average of 75% for all the countries, rejection of non-democratic alternatives from military rule, one-man rule, one-party rule, all of them remain far, very strong. Some of them much stronger. Rejection is much stronger than support. And that should tell us something about the continuing desire of West African citizens to live under democratic order. The same, when it comes to the preference for elections as the best way to choose government, you get 8 out of 10 citizens on the average saying that they prefer to use the ballot box as the mechanism for choosing government. And again, even the controversial idea of multi-party democracy still gets a solid majority support among West Africans compared to 36% who think it's a bad idea. And even more popular across West Africa is the idea of two-term limits for presidential tenure. And again, I want you to know this because I mentioned the case of, sorry, can you go back? Can you go back to the earlier slide? Pardon? No, okay, great, thank you. So you see that Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, where President Ouattara has decided to go for a third term, support for two-term limit among adult Ivorians is close to 80%. For Guinea, again, it's over 75%, and so on. So this idea is so popular that from where we sit, and because previous Afro-Barometer surveys yielded the same kinds of responses, anytime I hear any president in West Africa doing a third term, I know that they are going against the wishes of their citizens, and that if the citizens can help it, they will fight. One last statistic to show you is we've been asking this question about whether citizens prefer to have a government that is accountable, even if it means it's not so effective, versus a government that is more effective at getting things done over which they have no control. And it will interest you to know that on the average, a clear majority of citizens of West Africa say that they prefer accountable governance, even if it's not such an effective government. And I always lay emphasis on this, that if you're asking for trying to test people's commitment to democratic governance, to accountable governance, forget about elections, forget about just mere notional support for democracy, and look at this and realize that when people say they want democracy and democratic governance, they are not only talking about elections, they want accountable governance. And this is what the average West African says they want, and relative to, and that is something that they are not getting. And I'm suggesting that this is what is reflected in some of the upheavals that we are seeing in West Africa these days. So I want to end my remarks by just providing a few possible causes and explanations for these negative developments, so that as practitioners, as activists, as thinkers of democracy and governance in West Africa, we begin to wrap our minds about, it begins to give us some sense of what we may do and what we used to do very well that we should continue to do or should do better, and things that we haven't started doing that we should consider doing. I think the first for me is these are raising questions about whether we have constitutions without constitutionalism, and that we all know that some constitutional reform efforts have been made in some African countries. Many of them have not gone far. Many of them have been, some of them have been controversial, some have been blocked, and so on. But I think before we jump into supporting every instance of constitutional reform or review that we hear of, we should always ask ourselves the basic question: are these reforms going to reduce constitutionalism, or is going to increase constitutionalism? I suggest that we only support and promote and fund those constitutional review processes that clearly show that they are going to end in strengthening constitutionalism. I can't emphasize this enough because I see a lot of analysis about African constitutional reform efforts that just seem to think that if you go and stand in the middle of the street and you ask people to give you ideas about constitution and you compile them, then you have a good constitution. I'm afraid that's wrong-headed and it hasn't helped. In fact, some of the developments in Francophone Africa caused me to begin to wonder whether the sovereign national conference model that the Francophone countries used in making their constitutions is a good model after all. I think I just want to put a question mark and maybe say that we should interrogate it further. Again, we should interrogate the possibility that proportional representation does not necessarily make for strong parliaments, strongly representative parliament, and that, again, the fact that many of the Francophone West African countries have some form of proportional representation, but they are not doing as well when it comes to a two-party or multi-party system with strong opposition checkmating the incumbent government, as say Ghana has, and to some extent Nigeria has. We've got to question that maybe proportional representation is not what the answer to our problems. I think if you recall what happened in ECOWAS in the past, we are probably seeing.
Hello, Prof. If you could round up, please. Thank you.
All right. I have just give me 2 minutes or so, I will be done. But I wanted to talk about the lack of proactivity and instead the reactive tendencies on the part of ECOWAS and West African regional leaders and the African Union. That if you fail to monitor and proactively act to ensure that the governments that have been installed through elections, democratic elections, comply with democracy and good governance norms during their tenure. If you fail to monitor and check them, then don't be surprised if things go wrong and then you are running, basically closing the barn door after the cattle have left. So, and again, I think we should also be interrogating at this point the efficacy of the African APRM model and practice of post facto assessment of governance and democracy performance of African countries using less than clear metrics and a process and a framework that lacks any sense of clear consequence for good performance or poor performance. And then finally, we should be asking, are we seeing the negative effect of the absence of a Dr. Ibn Chambers figure at the ECOWAS Commission? And are we seeing the absence of towering leaders within the West African region who were sufficiently robust in their commitment to democratic governance and accountable governance, such as we used to have in the 2000s with Presidents Obasanjo, Kufuor, Agwabli, Alpha Konari, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I will end here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof, for that very rich presentation. The data from Afrobarometer, very, very interesting insights and perspectives from citizens in the region. And thank you for the reflective questions. I think there's a lot to think about. I'm just stepping in here because I believe Udo has a challenge with internet connectivity. And so I think we should move on to the next panelist. So the next panelist was introduced, and that is Farida. And Farida is a human rights activist and from Togo, and she's been part of movement building in various countries, not only in Togo, but within the continent, and has interesting perspectives from somebody who is on the ground working with citizens, and we are looking forward to her sharing her perspectives on this discussion today. So Farida, kindly go ahead.
Thank you, Charles. Sorry, I was taking a second to on my mic and camera. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to get to exchange with all these practitioners of civil societies as well as academia and activists and movement leaders about the future of democracy in our region. And this is such an important topic that we have to kind of like put our heads around. I will start my intervention by first and foremost kind of like bringing part of what Ms. Nana Afazinu has previously said, which are the fact that in the past years we have seen social movements providing a lot of opening for democratic advances in our countries in West Africa, from Senegal to Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Ghana, Togo. More and more social movements are actually being successful, and I would say even more successful at leading to certain changes than the traditional NGOs have been for the past decades. However, these social movements are as well faced by specific hurdles that I believe come naturally with the fact that the movements are in some extent new in the way that they operate, because today technology has given us a different platform and a different capacity to mobilize and organize and also communicate, which are all important components of movement building. So the new challenges that we are facing are also coming from the fact that the movements in themselves are new in their approaches. The sad thing about those movements, of social movements in the West African region, and I will say not just the West African region, but since we're in West Africa, it is the fact that they do not often transition to last structural changes in the government. As Ms. Afazinu has previously mentioned, the fact that certain movement, social society practitioners and leaders eventually, and in the case of a huge majority of people we know who did that, they have even failed to live up to the democratic values that they were preaching while in civil society, which kind of like harmed and damaged the image of civil society, but also the trust people have into civil society, as they now have the feeling that they will eventually also join government and be doing the same. In the case of social movements, the actors of the social movement have rarely had a chance at grasping power or even coming close to it. From Burkina Faso to Senegal to Togo, there is a total exclusion. And sadly, in many of those countries, and even recently in the Gambia, many of those countries, either the new government or the continuing one, after the end of this movement or the end of the citizens' protest that led to certain changes, after those movements, they have managed to consolidate power to the point where they became far more indomitable than they were before the whole movement started. So we also have to acknowledge the fact that the regimes in power and the government are also upping their games and their strategies by the day, and they are finding ways to make more complicated and difficult to citizens in the long run. And they are also managing to weaken as much as possible these resistance movements in civil society across the various countries. So I think it is necessary for us to find ways to empower and strengthen to push for the change all the way till the end, so that they do not limit the changes to some cosmetic ones, in order for them to be able to ensure not only the implementations of the policies that they have requested or the changes that they have demanded, but they can also have the tools and the resources to safeguard these policies and etc. Unfortunately, from my experience, one thing that I have noticed is that the social movement actors are often ill-equipped to be able to sustain those changes and to safeguard these hard-earned gains of democracy they have obtained through months of protests and organizing, or even years in some other cases. And the reason why we have different aspects, but the funding, excuse me, sorry, the funding issue, which is you brought earlier, is a real one, but the funding issue is a real one in a way that the inability, usually when you're fundraising for social movement, the majority of the funds often comes from the local communities themselves. The non-traditional organizations raise money non-traditionally because they do not have usually the structures in place to apply for donor fund. However, once that the movements have gained recognition nationally and internationally, they are approached in various ways by these donor organizations, these INGOs, who come in an effort to, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say in an effort to support them in the work they do. But sadly, in many cases, and even in my own case and experience, these organizations eventually, instead of helping this movement prosper, they end up turning them into organizations that basically live to their own specific goals. So it becomes a matter of publicity stunt of each international INGO trying to prove that they were part of the Yanama process or they were part of the Togo process, even though they were totally absent from A to Z, and their appearance in 2 seconds before the victory or before the big day to give the impression that they were included. And at that moment, unfortunately, they bring on their own agenda and requirements, and the social movement actors, being desperate to find resources to continue doing the work they do, they end up losing focus on their own predefined strategies and course of action and end up doing work and activities that can only suit the purpose of the donor, that falls under what the donor qualifies, as fundable, and it eventually weakens the movement. And I'm going to give, this is not an attempt to bash donors or INGOs, but I want to give some palpable and simple examples to kind of like support what I am saying. In our case in Togo, for example, for the many years that we organized, the Farmers Go movement, for example, was funded in 2011. Other movements were funded after that in the process, but it wasn't until 2017 that all the Togolese society forces decided to join together under the Front Citoyen Togo de Vous flag. But when we were in that process, our goal and our initial and only goal was to basically bring an dynasty which has been ruling Togo for over 50 years, making it the longest military regime on the continent. But when the movement gained traction, and then we became acknowledged and recognized, and organizations from various ends of the world, including regionally and internationally, were coming in and wanted to support. Basically, all the activities were no longer activities that were meant to bring down a military regime, because even those organizations in their languages, they cannot openly say they're campaigning to bring down the regime. So we have to soften the stance. We have to soften some of the activities. We have to avoid using certain language. And in my cases, I had to turn down, and some of our comrades have to do the same, turn down multiple propositions because we feel like, yes, this looks good on paper as something that is promoting democracy and freedom, but implementing it in a country that is totally against democracy, and that is not only hostile, but willing to kill basically actors of society, those propositions can only lead to cosmetic changes. But sadly, the lack of resources eventually leads many actors in the social movements to focus entirely on what the donors want so they can qualify for the funding, and they use the very little resources that they have, which is their time, which is their network, which is their intellectual capacity, to focus on the donors' activities or the INGO's activities, which at the end do not really touch the regime in a way that it's supposed to, or which do not bring us the kind of change that we are going forward to. So it is important for those organizations as well, when they are coming in, to be able to ask the right question. Is our support to these movements that we want to give them, is it our support to our own image, or a real support that is going to help the movement achieve what they're doing? Because unfortunately, in many cases, it has been, those have been support that have, I cannot say hinder, but have slowed down the movement considerably, and have actually, that slowing down process have only helped the government in power consolidate their power even more, or recalibrate in a way that they can make it even more difficult for those activists or those organizers to get back to their resistance once they decide to go back to it. So empowering and strengthening and equipping social movement leaders in such a way that their work is actually amplified and strengthened, not in a way that their work has to be aligned to the agenda of national, of regional or international partners. That's one thing that I believe matters a lot, that we need to think about. The other thing that I will also mention is that social movements, I believe, in the upcoming years will continue to make a major impact and will continue to give us breakthroughs to ending authoritarian government far more than we have seen in the past, because more and more citizens are expressing themselves. And as Prof has shared, citizens, no matter how efficient their government is or not, they do want accountability. And the lack of accountability and impunity that we are witnessing in the continent is aggravating citizens by the day, to the point where more people are organizing every day and demanding change. So we will see more social movements growing in the past. But I believe that the past decade of social movements and what we have seen them become and the changes we have seen them lead to provide an opportunity for us to collect lessons learned as well as best practices in order to better prepare the ones that will be upcoming. So they are no longer movements that take us by surprise, where at the last minute, everybody is thinking about how to help. And by wanting to help at the last minute, we suffocate the movement to the point where we crush them. But rather we prepare and we learn the lesson so that we start preparing when people rise again in countries like Togo, in countries like Nigeria, in countries like Guinea, they are supported the way they are supposed to be able to lead to a change that is sustainable, a change that is scalable, and a change that can truly help us safeguard the gains of democratic freedoms that have been acquired through the resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Farida. I think, Udo, you can take it. Are you back?
Yes.
Okay. Then,
yes,
Udo,
I'm back.
Okay.
Technology is dealing with me.
Yes, sorry so much. I forgot to introduce myself, though. I'm Charles Van Dyke. I work at WAXI. Apologies for that. So, Udo, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. But my be on standby, please, Charles. Just in case
Sure.
The elements are working against me here. So thank you, Farida. I'll be coming back to you with some more questions, but first let me go to Ms. Ajeman just to talk a bit about how technology has played a role in strengthening citizens' engagement of the democratic process within the continent, within the region. And in your experience, what has been the challenges and what opportunities do you see going forward to use technology to address this issue of a democracy that is in retrogression within the region?
Most definitely. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be on this panel, this esteemed panel, and to share my perspective and my thoughts. I want to add the caveat that I come to this space from working in the philanthropic sector for about close to 20 years, and coming from the perspective as a grant maker and a grant seeker. And having the opportunity to have worked in a variety of roles on the program sides and on the operations. So I come to this thinking around technology and what it is doing and what it can do for the sector from the perspective of somebody who comes to that. I'm not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I have some very strong opinions about this. About 5 years ago, me and my fellow co-founder of Epic Africa started on a journey. And we started on this journey to build an organization. We consider ourselves a data-driven philanthropic intermediary. And what we are attempting to do is to leverage data across this continent to be able to help African CSOs be more open, accessible, transparent, so that they are able to leverage their own data to be able to attract resources from local and also international partners. And I think when we talk about this topic of technology, I think when we put in a sentence together, Africa, technology, CSOs, it seems as if it's an oxymoron, excuse me, but it is not. We look at the wider world around us and we see how technology essentially is ruling everything. We see how in this 21st century, the titans and the barons of industry are these huge tech firms who are capitalizing and leveraging our data. And what they've been able to do quite concretely is to be able to convert that data into knowledge. We in this sector have started to do that. When we leverage technology in this sector, oftentimes within the humanitarian space, it has been around being able to use that to leapfrog in amazing ways on this continent, to be able to streamline logistics, to be able to look at how we can reconfigure health systems and a variety of other matters. When we look at the sector that we have all come together to talk about today around governance, around democracy, when we are leveraging technology, oftentimes it's around the civ tech realm, where we often are using these technologies to be able to shine the spotlight oftentimes on what sometimes government is not doing well, what we need to push others to be accountable for. And I just want to go back to a point that Nana and Farida have made, which is that we also as a sector have to look within ourselves to look at how we become accountable. And I wanted to throw out a controversial idea that technology which we are using to shine a light oftentimes on our adversaries in this shrinking space, why don't we use that to shine a light on ourselves to be able to leverage our own data for our own good? And if I can just explain a little bit more about what I mean about that. We have, as Nana rightfully said, on this continent, in West Africa, in our space, have many challenges, but there are also many opportunities. We have a credibility issue. We have a visibility issue. We have also, we're stressed around resources and a variety of different issues. But oftentimes, the criticisms that are hurled at us in this sector is that we are not transparent ourselves, we are not accountable, and we oftentimes are seen to be accountable to outside entities. Data is a way to be able to provide evidence, to be able to show and to be able to garner credibility in this sector. We at Epic Africa have been on a journey to attempt to do that in our small way. Oftentimes, CSOs are very scared to make themselves vulnerable by sharing their information. But we can only do this work if we learn how to do it better. As I said before at the top of this conversation, what other entities have done well in leveraging technology has been able to convert that data into evidence. And we need to be doing that better. We are currently, as the World Economic Forum says, in a fourth industrial revolution, whether we like it or not. And CSOs are critical in this discussion, in this dynamic, in this movement. We are the third sector. We are the third leg. There is government, there is business, there is us. So instead of using or oftentimes being in a place where we are butting heads with our oppositions, can we use data to be able to aggregate as a sector what we bring to the economy? We have seen evidence of this being done in other places, such as Kenya, where technology is much, much more utilized and advanced, where we've seen data about how they've been able to show that if the CSO sector was not available, 45% of healthcare would not be happening in Kenya. They are able to show that by collecting data on CSOs, that CSOs provide, about this is dated data, but this was from 2000, I believe, in 13. I'm hoping that there's more recent data than this, but this was 2.9% of GDP, about 300,000 jobs. I imagine that is so much more now. These ways in which, when we start to show our worth and our visibility, start to help us demand that space at the table that we so rightfully deserve. I know that I'm speaking to the converted, and there are ways in which various CSOs are already doing this. We know that across the continent, in places like Ghana, in places like Rwanda, in Liberia, and in Kenya, where government has established specific offices within government to be able to at least try to collate information around CSOs, to be able to see and track the resources which are coming into the country, and to be able to have some sort of visibility of what CSOs are actually doing on this continent. So what I wanted to just end on is that we oftentimes speak about technology in this sector. And when we do, it's often about technology such as Ushahidi, which for those of you who don't know, is an amazing platform, which is a homegrown African initiative, which was set up post-election violence in Kenya. And this was set up to be able to start to track where violence was happening. This technology firm then became an export to the world, and is being used in a variety of different ways to crowdsource information, to be able to be involved in elections and political processes, but to even also in humanitarian crises to be able to track information. When we speak about technology, we also maybe hold up amazing organizations like Budget Nigeria, which is really getting citizens engaged by being able to allow the common man or woman to be able to understand the complexities of the budget process. We also see what our amazing Afrobarometer is able to do in providing evidence to show what ordinary citizens across this continent are thinking. We need more initiatives like this. And I think that oftentimes these technologies that we are often using within our CSOs and space are oftentimes exports from other places, which oftentimes are helping us react to a very emergency situation. But I want to challenge us all that within this technological revolution, we as CSOs are also primed to be involved in also attempting to design, to be able to make culturally specific technologies to be able to utilize for our constituencies. I'll go back to the topic of Epic Africa. We started on a journey to be able to design a platform which would invite African CSOs to share their data. We had a lot of distractors who told us African CSOs will not share this information. They don't want to be transparent. Why would they want to be? And we found out through developing a methodology where we worked on providing an incentive system to CSOs to be able to bring them into our orbit, that this was the way to be able to go. And I want us to also challenge these notions around technology and how they are sometimes things from outside. We need to think about ways in which we can also be part of the equation. We can also be part of shaping what we need to be able to push forward in this regard. I just wanted to end by just sharing a quote from the late great Kofi Annan. And it's just to indicate how some of those who have even become our ancestors now were futurists. And shortly before he passed, he shared this amazing quote around data. And he said, "Data gaps undermine our ability to target resources, develop policies, and track accountability. Without good data, we're flying blind. If we can't see it, we can't solve it." So I want us to really have also a family conversation, because we are all part of one sector, about what we can do to be able to leverage data, to be able to create the case, to enhance our own visibility, to be able to mobilize resources within our own African context, and be able to demand that seat at the table. I think on that note, I will end for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ajua. Thank you so much for that very eloquent presentation on the importance of data, on the importance of using data for our work, the importance of using evidence to drive the work that we're doing, and the fact that Epic Africa is actually going against the grain and actually getting this done in a continent that people told you that it can't be done is very, very inspiring and encouraging. So we've heard 4 amazing, I believe, presentations and very passionate presentations first from Nana, giving a perspective of civil society contributions, and she gave a historical perspective of civil society contributions in the region and how civil society has evolved throughout the times now that experiencing in democratic practices and to those practices. But she also talked about an issue of civil society resilience and the resourcing issues around civil society. She also touched on accountability and the importance of civil society being more accountable and transparent. And she also touched on the sustainability of civil society, of course, looking at the impact of COVID, which has exposed our underlying weaknesses. And these are some of the things that are really stunting the ability of civil society to do a more robust engagement in the democratic space. And then we had a presentation from Prof, who gave us very, very great perspectives of not only the challenges, but also the positive contributions that have been made over the years. And he stated specific contributions that have been made by our regional organization, ECOWAS, contributions that were made at the country level in our various countries in strengthening and democracy, as a reminder that it's not all doom and gloom, but things have been happening, and there's been some amount of progress in terms of deepening our democratic governance. And then Farida also came in with very interesting perspectives on movement building, on how movements can and should be supported, and her experience in being part of movement and the challenges that she faced being in these movements. And of course, she spoke on an important issue of translating the gains of movements into actually transformation within the political systems in which they are trying to change. And of course, also gave some very good recommendations about the role of donors and how donors can support even much better movements so that movements can be more robust and stronger and more effective. So I believe we've had very, very rich and resourceful presentations. And I believe there are a lot of people on this call who want to ask questions. So at this point, if you can find the button, for raising your hand, it would be great. Or if you can't, you can just type in the chat function, whether if you want to ask a question or make a contribution. Can everybody use the chat function? Is the chat function available, please? Are we able to type in the chat function on the chat? Okay. I've seen a hand raised. That's great. I particularly find it difficult to find this hand myself, so I'm really happy that colleagues are finding the hand. Great. Thank you so much. So we have somebody who would like to ask a question. Valnora Edwin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Valnora Edwin, and I'm wearing many hats as I sit here, but I've been within the civil society space for the last 20 years. And I think that I can resonate with quite a lot of the issues that have been raised. I would like to thank the four speakers. I think I do agree with all the concerns and the issues they've mentioned. We have made some progress, but certainly there are some challenges that we need to be prepared to address. It's not necessarily about question, but just to also share some thoughts based on what they've said. I think the professor actually mentioned about some of the gains we've made, and it's not all doom and gloom. But then it brings back to the issues Nana raised and the two other speakers about the civil society space itself. How well prepared are we to understand the context in which we're operating and be prepared to address the challenges that occur? I think a couple of months ago, there was a discussion about the role of civil society within the COVID environment and how so many organizations have been able to adapt based on the trend. So there's some thoughts I would like to share. One thing is, as the professor mentioned, the issue around the constitution. I would like to talk about Sierra Leone. We have had opportunities to review our constitution that we think would be helpful in terms of addressing some of the challenges we have. But progressively, the government that instituted it, and unfortunately we had a new government, they are still yet to take it on board. And definitely provisions within the Constitution would certainly help to address some of the issues we are talking about, the extended term limits, the issue around civil society space so that it's not contracted, the issue around media freedom, and all these human rights progressively that can fit in within our cultural dynamics. The other thing I'd like to make mention is what specifically the last speaker mentioned, and I want to commend them for their initiative. It's about the homegrown solutions. I think largely we depend a lot on what the West prescribes, what countries in the West, and largely I think it's because our donors are mostly from the West. But I think if we start looking inwardly, we'll realize that we do have a lot of resources that we can make use of. We have structures and institutions like ECOWAS that we need to connect with more extensively. And we might want to ask what is happening to WACSOF, for example. How strategic is WACSOF within the current conversation that we are having? And I think the last 2 points I'd like to make is one, there was a mention of the influence of China, and the concern is China is not necessarily particular about human rights values. But then we see what is happening in these other countries that we think we're promoting human rights. We see some of the human rights deficiencies they also have. So again, it comes back to the point about our own homegrown solutions, looking inwardly, what are our cultural values, how can we promote initiatives and interventions that are more sustainable with the structures and the context in which we survive. And the issue around CSOs becoming partisan is really a problem. And people argue, again, looking at it from a Western lens, that there are CSOs or media houses that are...
Movement wanted the departure of 4 Nyasingbe, but we know that donors cannot be part of that agenda for fear of being accused of interference. What are some of the creative ways do you think, Farida, donors can support this type of movement for the sake of democracy and not being seen as interfering in a country's political affairs? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haita. If I would like to respond, please.
Yes, please. Kaita, thank you so much for the question. To respond to your question, what I will say is that there are many ways that social movement can be funded without the donor organizations going against their own regulations and laws preventing them from interfering directly in a country's government. In such a way that the work that is being financed may not directly have be shown as an agenda of, like, for example, if somebody submits a proposal, it shouldn't be a proposal saying we want you to give us money because for us to bring down the government. So the wording can still be formulated in a way that it does not appear as an interference. However, what I am calling that we should be careful about is to not totally impose activities on these movements that absolutely have nothing to do with what they are doing. In the first year of the 2017-18 protests in Togo, I will say that over 95% of events and activities that I was invited to take part in by international donors or international organizations, it's not always the donors, mostly it's the organizations, they have nothing whatsoever to do directly with what we were doing. So it's basically they themselves have their own agenda. They have an idea of the kind of help they want to bring to you, and they call you and say, we're doing it in Togo, but not come and sit down. We want to do this and this. We want to build your capacity in doing this, but actually building my capacity in doing what that is has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing. And many activists have felt the same way, to the point where when we realized the issue, we said that we are going to decide not to go to many of those events anymore, as long as they don't fit in directly with what we are doing. So imposing activities, imposing plans, and thinking that it's a one-size-fits-all. So our organization, all we do is doing an activity on let's say, peace building or any other topic, you name it. So they're doing something in Togo, we want to be part of it, so let's invite them to come and have our training. So yes, it's like you can be a doctor, but if your specialty is treating cancer and somebody is having a gynecological problem, you just don't call them to come and be your patient because you have services to offer. Yes, you want to help, but the help has to be directed to what they need. Because whenever you're inviting them to those events, you have to be acknowledged of the fact that they may, even though you are paying for hosting them, for food or whatever it is, or even per diems or financial resources you're giving them, it is not as valuable as the time you are taking away from them for organizing. And every time they lose at organizing, they are giving more time to the government to consolidate power. So that's the message that I wanted to bring. So there are wordings that can be used to avoid catching the attention of, avoid the accusation of interference, but always guaranteeing that whatever support is being given should be support requested, not support predefined by the givers. at the end of the day, it's no longer what people want as help, it's you giving them what you just feel like you want to give them. I hope that answers your question, Ms. Keita.
Excellent, Farida. Thank you so much for that. Just before Prof goes, and we'll come to, there are some questions for Nana and Adjoa too, but just before Prof goes, Prof, there's a very interesting question from a young person. He says, I'm a young West African, I'm a young person in West Africa. And this is the question. I want to read it as he wrote it. He says, ECOWAS has been quiet since both Ouattara and Condé declared that they are moving ahead with plans for a third mandate. We have already seen violent clashes in both countries. Can we say that ECOWAS has become toothless or inefficient? If not, how do we explain its lack of action in the face of such a blatant violation of democracy? And this is a question, the Prof, that this young man wants an answer to.
Thank you. And again, I think the very young man has summarized essentially the point I was trying to put across, that what we see of ECOWAS today and what we see of West African regional leaders today is that they are a mere shadow of their past counterparts and their past formations, and that we are seeing a huge gap in ECOWAS leadership, a lot of lack of commitment or insufficiently robust commitment to the advancement of democracy and governance, good governance in their own countries, let alone across the continent. And that if there is anything that we as citizens and as CSOs and NGOs and others can do to put fire under their feet, we must be doing that, because we count on them. We don't have access to those leaders, but our presidents have access to those leaders, and we should get them to do the right thing. And we should be putting pressure on ECOWAS, and we must try to grow another Dr. Ibn Chambers.
A quick follow-up. The follow-up he's asking is, yes, he often hears that the CSOs must take action. The thinking now is the actions, the traditional advocacy that we've been doing, the traditional research and engagement, consultation, quiet diplomacy, it looks like justice is grinding very slowly. So are there any recommendations on how CSOs can do things a bit more differently to suit the times so that the changes are more transformative and timely?
I mean, first of all, it's clear that at least in Ghana here, it's rare to hear the media or CSOs paying attention to what is going on outside of the country. We tend to be too narrowly focused on issues in our respective countries when we live in a region and on a continent where each country's fate is somewhat implicated with the fate and well-being of people in the other country. So I think what I think we should do first is to end this tendency to look in a narrowly focus on democracy and governance and development challenges in our own countries to the exclusion of the others. Second, I think that what we in civil society and in the media do is in the spirit of what Akan said, that if you want to speak to God, you speak through thin air. So we should be making noise. We should be letting our governments know that what the fate of the people of Togo with respect to the kind of denial that they've been experiencing under Yadema matters to us as Ghanaians, matters to us as Nigerians, and we are judging our presidents and our governments by actions and inactions they take with respect to Togo and ending some of the carnage there. So that's, there's not much we can do, but the same use of mouth, use of voice, it's something that we can do and should do.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. And I would like to thank you so much for joining us. We know you had a very busy schedule, but you joined us.
Great pleasure, and
We're
thank
really
you
thankful.
for the opportunity.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Bye. There's a very interesting question for both Nana and Adwoa, and the question is from Jonathan. It's a very, very interesting question, and it's about the political parties. And remember, of many of our countries, even not seen as election machines and not necessarily policy oriented. So the question by Jonathan is, how can CSOs work in partnership with political parties, and of course also both in the ruling parties and opposition parties, to transform them from this election machine mentality to more of a policy-oriented organizations? So if Nana or Adwoa, you would like to share your perspective on that. What can CSOs do in terms of engaging political parties?
Yeah, I think that we should look at the political context and the whole idea around elections and what our political parties have been set up to do. Because it looks like the political parties are really just electioneering machines. And that's what they've been. In between, we should ask ourselves, in between elections, what do our political parties do? I mean, and so what can CSOs do? We can engage them. But you must, and I know that in some countries, there are some CSOs that have tried to engage political parties. But then it takes two to tango. They must be willing to work with the civil society organizations that are interested in working with them to look at how they can build, really look at ideology, look at how they can have policies and look at long-term development for a country and what kind of contribution a political party can make, even beyond elections. But I think the main goal is about winning power, which is of course important because you do need the power to do other things. But then that is the goal, and it doesn't matter what it takes to win that power. And that is what political parties do. So that I believe that there would need to be some engagement, and there must be, I guess because of our history, we do have concerns, also as civil society organization, in engaging political parties. But I think that it is possible to do that on principles and values, and not looking at partisan politics, but being able, so you should be able to engage different political parties if you are dealing with them on principles and looking at values and ideology and all of those things. So that for me would be, there's an opportunity to do that, I believe, for political parties that are open and ready to do that. And if there are civil society organizations that have that expertise, that have that knowledge, I believe that they should go ahead and engage these political parties. But again, it will take their willingness to be part of that conversation.
Thank you, Nana, for that. So Adwoa, is there any role for data, the use of evidence and data? We have a lot of think tanks doing really great work. EPIC is doing great work in terms of getting data. Is there any role of data and technology in the opportunities for civil society to work with political parties? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Yes, most definitely. I think that during some of our surveying processes, because we're able to provide an opportunity in a quote unquote safe space to be able to ask questions, which there's no sort of judgment around, some of those questions, and at that time of even polling and surveying, allowed to be able to get direct information as to what actually CSOs think on a particular issue. So there's definitely the role of data to be also then shared in an unbiased way, just as we have recently shared our report on COVID, which polled over 1,000 CSOs, a little over 1,000 CSOs across the continent, about what the opportunities and challenges they were facing. And we hope to be able to do that in another few months. I just wanted to go back to the point that Nana was making, and I wanted to point out also that there is definitely the opportunity for civil society to be involved in that conversation. Most of the times around elections, we have a whole long list of promises. And I think in many contexts, not just on the continent, but in other places, these platforms that these officials to get elected on, what they put out there, there's opportunity for CSOs to use that as the way to check to see what you are able to do. I know in other contexts, I will use the US for example. There's an election which is coming. I know advocacy groups around immigration, for instance, actually have been involved in actually putting together the laundry list of what they want when and if a particular person gets into power. So there are ways in which this advocacy and quote unquote lobbying happens that I'm sure many groups and many think tanks are involved in. But I think that it has to be done and we have to aspire to do it in a bipartisan way as a civil society sector. So oftentimes it's better if we also band together to be able to do that, to do that advocacy. And data can be involved in that process by being able to survey and bring out that evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajab. Thank you so much for that very, very important contribution. There's a very interesting question about Guinea that I would like to share with all three panelists. But before that, Comfort has a contribution or a question to share. Comfort, please go ahead.
Hello, Charles.
Yes, please go ahead.
I have a question for Nana, and I was particularly interested in the part of her presentation where she talked about this trend where civil society actors, when they join government, for example, they become like the government, you know, they were opposing or, you know, wanting to change. And I notice a trend where the more things change, the more things remain the same. I'm contributing from Cameroon. We have noticed a trend where over the past couple of years, there's a lot of civil society and social movement building online, but this is not translating into actual policy changes on the ground. And the youth or the civil society actors on the ground usually will become like the system they're trying to change. And so online, there's a lot of advocacy, but when people, you know, put their boots on the ground and want to change, you start hearing, oh, this person's tone has watered down. This person is not as pushful as they used to be. And this is tied to the fact that once they want to, you know, be active on the ground, there are constraints, most of it financial, most of it, it's around the fear and security of sometimes mobilizing in physical spaces. So I guess my question for Nana is, how do we transform or how do we translate social activism online, which is big, it's powerful in Cameroon, and I'm sure in other West African countries? How do we bring this consistency, this loud voice and social movements from Twitter and Facebook and translate it into actual policy change on ground?
Yeah, thank you very much.
And just to give you a last example from the context of Cameroon, we have elections coming up, regional elections in December. Online, everybody's talking about it, they're arguing, they've been consistent for a whole year, but when you look at the voters registers, people have not registered. Same on voting day, there's so much momentum online, but it's not the same on the ground. And those who dare to go on the ground somehow feel out.
Yeah, I believe that this is a problem that has existed for a long time. And in cases where you have had activists really go out and show their faces is because one, either they were willing, for some of them, they were willing to sacrifice even their very lives for some of the change that has happened, or they really were willing to go ahead and sacrifice for the change. Two, because there was solidarity and they had support, either from their constituency, and very often you need that kind of strong solidarity amongst civil society organizations or activists, internally and externally. So I think that some of those things are missing these days. It's easy to tweet. It's easy to tweet and not necessarily show your face, or be on the ground and engage. And sometimes it's people are afraid of what they could lose if there's no protection, you know, and there's protection in numbers. So I really think that we need to do better at organizing and building solidarity and working together and breaking away from our silos. And I think that if we are able to really build a solid, why is it that often you have social movements really being able to make some of the change? Because you have the mass, you know, you have masses, you have people giving that kind of support. Yes, some people may be arrested, but there's a lot of supports that they have. So we need to build that support for what it is, the change that it is that we need. And I think that sometimes, or to some extent, particularly for NGOs, we have sometimes lost that. So that kind of building a movement, building connections, strong connections, both at the local level, national level, regional level, West Africa. Where are we as civil society in West Africa? How have we come together even to engage ECOWAS? We have that space. How are we using that space? So those are some of the things that I believe that we have to do better at. And when we do that, and people are willing to say, okay, yes, they may come at me, but if they come at me, I have this support and that support. If we are going, and we also have to equip ourselves, because if we are going to be engaging and using technology and all of those things, we must have the skill and the knowledge to protect ourselves. Protection is important, but that willingness also to sacrifice. And so the question is, how much is it that, how much are we willing to sacrifice for the work that we do and for our principles and the things that we stand for? And what is the support base? We have to build a support base and work together. So for me, those would be some of the ways, and particularly in where it could be very dangerous for you to be working. How do you protect yourself? And what can you do? And who can help? And so we need to do those things. I think that those things would help us to move from some of the online work that is going on to the ground to actually bring about the change.
Thank you so much, Nana, for that response. It's interesting because Fatou Han, our colleague from Guinea, also is raising that issue of how do we really organize, regionally, the issue of solidarity beyond our borders. And I think Farida could share an interesting perspective on this too. So Farida, what is your perspective on organizing beyond our own national, beyond our own silos? It would be interesting to hear your perspective on this.
Charles, thank you so much. And thank you to you as well, Nana. Before I respond to your question, Charles, I wanted to add one sense to what Nana has just said about the need to provide and build support for the social movements working in the different countries locally in order for the movements to be able to transition from online to the street and the communities. The support and the sense of security does matter, But beyond the support and services issue of security, we also have to be acknowledging the necessity of proper planning and strategy. It is true that when it comes to social movements, there are usually no real structures in which those movements are operating and rules. It's usually people that come together for a sustained campaign, and they want to fight to obtain the change that they are calling for. But without proper strategy, the tactics, which are in many cases taken for the strategies, they fail. Because a protest itself is a tactic, it's not a strategy. And you will see movement leaders, you will see activists calling for a protest, but then after the process, there is no clear strategy in the future. How do we scale the protest? How do we use other tactics on top of the protest, both on the street, in the international community, in the diaspora? Those different pieces are missing. And even the inability to obtain support, because in our case in Togo, we felt abandoned for so long, but the reality was not the fact that we were abandoned, it was the fact that we never even really properly worked towards seeking the help. We just assume that by being in Togo and making our own noise in our little corner, all of a sudden the whole world will notice us and will come and say, oh, the Togolese are fighting, let's go join them. So we did not include in our strategies an effort to mobilize support outside of our community. So proper planning and strategizing really, really does matters. And the social movement leaders have approached building scientifically and take those into account, they are often more successful than those who just act spontaneously. Now, to respond to Fatu's question, to whom I say hi, by the way, we do need networks, and we do have networks existing already, but unfortunately, we are unable to utilize the few networks that we already have to promote solidarity within our countries. We are unable to use them efficiently. So it is important for us to, first of all, identify those who are the actors fighting for the type of changes that we are fighting for. Because sometimes the mistake is to put all the activists or movement leaders in the same group and expect them to be able to be useful to one another in terms of working together, building tactics and strategies. But we have to be able to identify them specifically based on the target, based on the goals that they have, and to be able to organize them around these common goals. More of this needs to be done. Language barrier has been a serious problem for many, especially in the Francophone ones, because they feel like many of the times that there are spaces organized for activists to come together or organizers to come together across the region or the continent. Those events or activities often happen in English, and they do not, because they don't speak the English, many of them do not speak the English, or they don't speak it fluently, they do not really know how to make themselves useful or how to take advantage of that. So language barrier is a problem that we have to take into consideration. But we can still organize despite those language barrier, but we have to have people who are interested in taking some time in building those structures. And the reality is we are also overwhelmed, and we are constantly in a system where we are reacting to the government rather than planning on, I don't want to use the word attack, but rather than planning on how to weaken the pillars of authoritarianism. So our actions and are always responsive, not properly planned. And that causes a lot of exhaustion, and we get so busy and entangled into responding and reacting to the actions of the government to the point where we forget about setting up the ground pillars, identifying partners, building partnership, building support, identifying people who can help us scale our efforts. So we need to have people who are dedicated into doing that, because they understand the importance of having those systems. And their effort is to just make sure that the systems are strong enough to be able to be used to provide solidarity for the movement across the countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. That was very, very insightful. Thank you so much. Really great recommendations that you've made there in terms of how we can organize within our region. Yes, so because of time, I think at this juncture, I would like to invite my colleague, John. I mean, usually he sits behind his own PC, but I think he's having a few internet issues. So he will come here and give us a couple of the highlights that he has captured from this conversation, especially the recommendations on what civil society should be doing and can do, and some of the things that we should be working on to strengthen our democracy in this region. So John, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you so much, distinguished panelists. This has been a very enriching conversation. So I just have a few recap. So I will just go ahead and then have an overall context of the conversation, and then I follow up with key recommendations. So yes, we did have a very interesting conversation that started with Jude. Thank you so much, Jude. I guess Jude is not dropped out of the call at the moment. But yes, Jude took us through a context of the situation, the democracy and governance situation in West Africa. And he did highlight the fact that, yes, West Africa has been seeing recent recessions in democracy trends, which is also reflective of what is happening at the global level. Of course, he did mention the fact that the excitement is waning across the region. The excitement that we had three decades ago when Benin, the wave of democracy started in Benin and swept across West Africa, that has waned over the course of the years. He did touch on other countries that have actually seen reversals, like Guinea, like Mali, like Cote d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso. And this is why we have to have conversations like this and look at what is happening to our region. How are we going to support the democracy and governance building across the region? Yes, so he did mention the fact that, yes, the inefficiency of our regional bodies is also a cause of concern. Of course, he did highlight the fact that, yes, they are very important, but most of the things that they do are actually reactive rather than being proactive in dealing with the issues or the deteriorating democracy in the region. He did underscore the fact that, yes, civil society is crucial to resolving some of these issues across the region. And that is why this conversation is really, really important. So yes, we then move from there to talk about the nitty-gritties of the issues. And Nana started with an overview of what civil society contributions would be for the democracy and governance strengthening across the region. But first, she gave us a historical overview of the role of civil society across the region, from pre-colonial days to colonial days to pre-independence, and also post independence around the era of the Cold War, after the Cold War, and also recently, most recently, the Arab Spring, and also the new movements that we saw or we are seeing from that new landscape. But Nana also underscored the fact that even though we have contributed a lot in dealing with issues of inequality, dealing with issues of democracy backsliding in the region, there are other things that CSO still are challenged with, and that is one of them is the rise in civic space, civic space issues. We also have rising funding issues, and also governments that are trying to capitalize on some global norms like the anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing issues to actually clamp down on the work of civil society across the region. Now, she also talked about the leadership challenge with civil society and the fact that, yes, we are always outward looking, looking at what is happening out there, but not really interrogating ourselves and questioning ourselves in our leadership roles. So it is time that we have to have that conversation as well. Yeah, so that was Nana's overview, and she also talked about the fact that, yes, there are other civil society actors that have crossed to the political side, but are not really espousing the civil society ideals that they had preached. So in that case, for civil society among the public. And with that, we moved to Professor Jima, who also gave us a really quick overview. I mean, Professor Jima started with recalling what has already happened in the region with regards to civil society work, and the fact that, yes, there has been some things that we should be proud of. Yes, there have been some democratic achievements that we should be proud of. But nonetheless, we have those reversals that we need to talk about. He gave us a quick overview using the Afrobarometer data, which clearly covers a number of countries and also covers citizens' attitudes and opinions about democracy and governance in the region. Prof also raised issues of corruption and autocratic networks that are not essentially in for the benefit of people and all that. Yes, he did also mention the fact that, yes, while popular demand for democracy is really high across West Africa, the supply is really, really low. And that is something that we should be thinking about, because what citizens actually want are open, accountable politics, which they are not actually seeing. And then we have also Farida, who talked about movements, the new movements, and the role that they play in strengthening our democracies. Of course, new movements are challenged in many ways. One of the ways that they are challenged is the fact that, yes, they are actually new themselves and their approaches are quite new. And also the relationship between new movements and international organizations and international donors sometimes can be very, very patronizing. And that is something that we should be looking at quite critically. Ajua also talked about the importance of technology, the importance of civil society leveraging technology to support its work, to support democratic processes, and also to highlight the contributions of civil society across the region, which is very important and which is something that civil society organizations have ignored for so long. And so, yes, those were the main points that I could summarize. I think I left, did I leave? No. So yes, so these are the main summaries. So in terms of recommendations, we do have a number of interesting points that were raised, and I will just run through them quickly. So one of them is for civil society to really reflect and take a serious look at what is really happening around civil society. Look at our finance and look at what we use to build our interdependency with the international in the international development arena or structure to talk about more to really get to the point where we have that balance in the shift of power that has been that competition has been going on for some time now. The other point is that civil society has to also look at its engagement. How do we rope in the private sector? If we really want to achieve impact at scale, we need other collaborators, we need other support. How do we rope the private sector? How do we rope in those at the true grassroots without just feeling like we are engaging public officials or elites in the country? In that way, we'll be able to achieve our impact at scale. For other recommendations are that we should be able to interrogate the possibility of, proportional representation, whether it is really serving us good. And this is coming around issues of representation, issues of participation, and all that. For example, some of the issues we are seeing across the region doesn't really tell us that, yes, proportional representation is actually helping us in any good way. So yes, that is something that we need to carry that conversation forward. Civil society organizations must also be proactive and not just rely on regional bodies. We have to step out there, do our bidding ourselves, create the space for ourselves if the space is not even created for us. And that is something that also requires a lot of resources, a lot of resources, and also a lot of leadership from civil society. Other recommendations are that we should also empower and strengthen the social movement leaders. There's been this talk about social movements that are very new, and their approaches are new, so they need that kind of support. But in supporting social movements, in supporting the leadership of social movements, we should bear in mind that that support should actually be in a way that would allow them to advance their agenda of democratic change, democratic governance, without actually implementing the actions or the agenda of outside bodies or international organizations. And we should also leverage technology to showcase our contribution to society, our contribution to national development, our contribution to the society in general, because it's only that way that governments will take us seriously. It's only that way that the citizens will build their trust on civil society. The other recommendations, or the final recommendations that I have, are that civil society should also have a conversation on how to use data, not just to track government or to track what government is doing or what government is not doing well, but also to mobilize resources that is crucial for civil society to be able to influence policy and policy processes and overall democracy across the region. 2 or 3 last points and I am done. Yes, so yes, the last few points are that, yes, civil society must also pay attention to what is happening across our borders. We tend to be very, very country-centric, very focused within and not outside. I know most of the organizations here are regional organizations, so we tend to focus more outside. We tend to focus also outside our borders. But yes, for the most part, civil societies are always very within. So we need to look at issues outside our borders that also affect us in some ways. Related to that, we also have to show solidarity with movements, democratic movements and groups across the region or in other countries that are trying to support the processes. Civil societies must also remain vigilant on what is happening within their countries and also outside their countries. We should also be looking at the political context and the political parties and see what they can do beyond just serving as election machines, as Nana mentioned. Yes, because we only hear about them, we only see them, but we only see how active they are during elections, which is not the case. Elections is just one aspect of political party responsibility. So we should be looking at that as well. So we should find a way to properly engage political parties outside electioneering periods. And the last but not the least, civil society also need to break away from our silos, working in silos. We need that collaboration, because it is only through collaboration that we can have that critical mass to be able to achieve impact at scale. Thank you so much. And this has been a really wonderful and enriching conversation. Thank you, and back to Charles.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for that very comprehensive summary and recommendations. Very, very helpful, John. Thank you. I believe you've captured all the issues that were discussed today, very important issues. So just before we leave, we part, I just want to indulge our panelists, Farida, Nana, and Ajwa, just to give us some a few in 1 minute, a call to action from their perspective, a call to action. What should we be doing from their perspective, from where they sit? What is the most important priority in terms of civic engagement in democracy? So I'll start with you, Nana.
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe that our people are aware now, and we need to engage them a lot more. We therefore have to look at what it is that could be done to strengthen our partnership with citizens and communities. That means looking at ourselves, and that means building the trust that is needed. That means being strong ourselves as institutions. It means looking at building partnership and solidarity. We've already talked about it. And also addressing the issue of resourcing. And I think we talked about local philanthropy and how we should build the infrastructure and the culture that supports social justice work, social protection, social accountability. I think that we would need to have a conversation as a region on what it is, some of the concepts: democracy, philanthropy, civil society, development, and what it really means for us through our indigenous knowledge and understanding, so that we have something. I think Valnora talked about homegrown solutions that can, it's a long-term conversation. This is not a short-term thing, but I think we need to have that conversation and do the research that supports it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana. Farida, your parting words, please.
Thank you, Charles. What I have to say is that we need to understand that the political context of our countries are evolving and very fast. And it is constantly a challenge for us in civil society to keep up to the pace of the changes that are occurring both in governments and within the constituencies. And it is important that we understand the importance, the need for us to grow, to continuing building on the structures that we have, but also continuing to identify the mistakes that we are making or have made in the past in order to minimize or mitigate as much as possible a backlash towards all the efforts that we put into making our societies more democratic. So my recommendation is that we continue in strengthening our structures and strengthening our communities in a way that we develop a certain resiliency, so that no matter what type of change comes to us, whether sudden or subtle, we are able to bounce back and democracy doesn't die in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. Thank you. Very insightful. Ajwa, if you can share your perspective in terms of your parting message to us.
Sure. I think that both the ladies who have gone before me have basically said it all. But if I could just add that, I think that we as a sector are at a very critical juncture right now. I think that a lot of the things that we have been talking about moving on and mobilizing around, I really believe that this pandemic has made a lot of these issues, has exacerbated a lot of these issues. So we need to come together to put our rhetoric into action and to continue and to understand that this is a long game, and we need each other to be able to capitalize on the gains that we have already made. thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm really glad to have been part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adjoa. And I'll just use your parting words there. It's a long game and we need to work together. That means organize. So this is about solidarity. This is ensuring that we keep our citizens engaged. This is ensuring that citizens participate at every level of our governance processes. And we need to do that together. And I think that's the message, that we need to find a way to work much better together in order to get our democracy where we want it to be. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, Professor Jimobuedi, who was with us, Farida, Nana, and Adjoa for joining us, for sharing their perspectives, and also thank all colleagues who have been in this conversation with us today, discussing this very important subject of democracy in West Africa. Thank you so much on behalf of WACSI and on behalf of OSIWA. Thank you for participating in this very important discussion. So what we'll do is have a lovely day.